This is a path to chaos in America. It's unprecedented, it's unlawful, and it's un-American.
Make no mistake, this election was stolen from you, from me, and from the country.
The way they win is to cheat in elections. They cheat like dogs.
The continued efforts to delegitimize the 2020 election are resulting in candidates that are incentivized to push these lies, but also then you have a radicalization and activation across the voter base that are effectively, this is performative. This doesn't happen.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. Our guest today is Chris Krebs, the former director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency under the Department of Homeland Security, the person who was primarily responsible for safeguarding the security of our elections in 2020. Chris, welcome to Washington Post Live.
Hey, David, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
So just to situate our audience, Chris, in his role as head of CISA, was called on to guarantee the security of the elections and said after the elections of 2020 that they were, and I'm using the words of the release that was issued, the most secure in American history, and that there was no evidence that any votes were deleted, lost, or compromised. And for that statement of the security and reliability of the elections, Chris Krebs was fired by the Trump administration for standing up for the validity of our elections. Chris, I want to ask you, one day before our midterm elections, why is this threat to our democracy that was so evident in 2020 from President Trump continuing? And what do you tell your Republican friends when they spread what we've taken to calling the big lie, this argument that the 2020 election was stolen?
David, so just to provide some additional context around that statement on November 12th of 2020, not that that date is seared in my brain at all, but that was a assessment by the election administration and election security community, state and local election officials, vendors, other folks that are involved in the actual administration of elections, and that was their assessment. And so CISA, as a part of a coordinating group, issued that statement and amplified the statement. And not only was it deemed to be a safe and secure election, I think the statistics behind that statement stand up. It was certainly the most scrutinized election. We've seen, the intelligence community investigated, reported, secured the election. It was the most litigated, both pre and post-election. 8+ lawsuits before the election, 60+ after, and it was the most audited election. So by the time 2020 rolled around, there were 43 states plus the District of Columbia that had some form of post-election audit. So the number of eyeballs that were on that election with no appreciable fraud, as Attorney General Barr pointed out in the wake of the 2020 election, I think supports the statement, supports the assessment of the group. Now, to the point of why does it persist to today, 2 years later? Well, because it pays, frankly. I mean, both financially, it's a great fundraising mechanism for the former president and a number of political officials and candidates for office, as well as elites and influencers, which leads to the second reason of why it persists, because it's a great clout chasing mechanism. I mean, we continue to see sitting officials as well as former administration officials from the last administration, push narratives and push themes and push lies about the election when they should know better. If not, they certainly could find out how elections are actually administered. But it gets them engagement, and there are a number of studies that show when influencers, elites, or candidates post about normal, mundane issues that we should be talking about, like inflation, like the border. Instead, they post about these election lies, and it gets them additional engagement. So it's a benefit to them from an incentive perspective. And I think the real harm is that it is shifting the Overton window. It's shifting what's politically acceptable in American political discourse into something that's much more dangerous and much more violent. So when I go out there and I talk to folks, and I talk to a number of current GOP officials in the House and the Senate, and I encourage them to speak up and debunk. And you do see some of them doing it. I think Dan Crenshaw from Texas is a great example. Just recently on a podcast talked about how it's all lies. And we need more of that. We need leaders to step up and speak truth to the American people about how our elections are working, because there's no good way out of this based on our current trajectory in this downward spiral of lack of confidence in American elections.
So, Chris, let me put it to you straight up at the outset of our conversation. Do you think that our democracy is at risk because of the behavior you just described?
Well, I think, if you really want to talk about the tactical aspects of democracy at risk, it's more the fact that we have a number of candidates for Secretary of State in Arizona and in Nevada and Michigan, and even the governor in Pennsylvania that selects the Secretary of State. Those candidates have the ability to determine the certification of the 2024 election. So we're actually seeing election denialists on the ballot across the country, and that's the real tactical risk to democracy. But more broadly, look, if our political leaders continue to push these lies about democracy, then I think the American people, the voting base, and citizens in general will lose confidence, will lose faith, and that that manifests in a couple different ways, including reduced turnout. It leads to legislation at the state and federal level that changes the way that elections are administered, not for the better. So yeah, I think there's both a tactical and strategic risk to American democracy.
In tomorrow's midterms, some candidates, the Republican candidates, are already saying they won't commit to the election results. President Biden, in a speech last week, called this move unprecedented and unlawful. Give us your assessment of a situation in which, seemingly emulating former President Trump, Republicans are saying, I may not accept this outcome. What are we seeing here?
I think it's a sad state of affairs and a bit of an indictment of Republican candidates right now, where it's become fashionable to be vague or ambiguous and not be able to commit to the will of the people. When there is no evidence whatsoever that the government has been able to find, they're not aware of any right now threats or other risks to the process of administering elections that would upend an otherwise free and fair election. So again, the fact that it is a mainstream, almost platform issue for a number of Republican candidates, I think it's a real crisis. And one of the issues that frustrates me a great deal is that we see some both sidism, right? We see this equivocating between what Stacey Abrams has done in the past, what Hillary Clinton has done in the past. But let's be very, very clear that those individuals did not incite an insurrection, an attack on the Capitol of the United States in an effort to upend and interrupt the electoral counting process. We did not see a behind-the-scenes conspiracy to, lodge false and fake electoral college, from the individual states, from the various states. And so, one thing is, claiming that election was stolen and actually doing something behind it. And I think that's a key lesson learned, and certainly should be taken to heart by everyone involved in the political process right now, is you do not mess around with the overall, the trust behind the electoral process and the confidence behind it. It is not a game. You do not claim that an election was stolen. And if you do, you better follow through, and you better bring up some stats, and you better have some litigation behind it that means something rather than what we've seen in the past. So I think that in an era where previously it required two good faith actors in an election, where really what you're doing in the election is proving to the loser that they lost. When you lose the second good faith actor and they're acting then in bad faith, I think that's where this trust in the American political process starts unwinding.
Let's talk about an ominous new development in this election democracy story, and that's the growing evidence of efforts to intimidate voters. Across the country, teams of poll watchers and other observers in far greater numbers than in the past seem to be dispatched. And I wonder if you see an organized movement underway to make Americans suspicious of their democratic election process so as to achieve their ends.
Well, I think what we tend to lose sight of, particularly here inside the Beltway and at the national level, is that all politics are national, when in fact, most politics are actually at the retail local level. And what I think we've seen over the last couple of years is a distillation of these broader national concepts of the stolen and rigged election actually start trickling down into the local communities. And we've seen over the last couple of years, like the fraud it by the Cyber Ninjas team in Arizona. We've seen groups spring up like Clean Elections USA, which was organized in Arizona and elsewhere. But specifically to some of those poll watchers, or rather the ballot drop box watchers showing up in tactical gear, as we saw in the intro video. Those sorts of actions are entirely based on these themes of the stolen election and fraud, where once again, we have not had any sort of, there's no evidence to support these allegations, whether it's 2,000 Mules, which has been steadily debunked by, including Philip Bump from the Washington Post. But it leads to these mainstreaming of the lies, and it's activating a base that then is turning out in these performative, not just performative, but also quite likely very dangerous, at least the possibility for political violence out there across the country. So this is not just free radicals. This is not ad hoc. There is a coordination and, there's a broader sort of orchestrated activity here that we need to be very mindful of. And I think that this is where the Department of Justice, this is where the FBI, and this is where state and local law enforcement really need to step up and understand what's happening here and protect the voters. But the key takeaway, David, and I'll wrap this piece up here now, is that it is overwhelmingly safe for American voters to vote, whether you voted in advance through early or absentee voting, or to vote tomorrow. So do not let these people deter you from getting out there and voting. That is in part what they're trying to accomplish here. So speak your voice, get out there and participate in democracy.
I'm glad you said that, because those images of self-appointed election cops in tactical gear are scary, and you make the right point. Don't be backed off.
Well, David, one last element on this is that I do think that, kind of due to the clumsiness of these groups getting out there and watching ballots, they actually tipped their hand early, which allowed for law enforcement to understand what was happening and then have the right interventions. And you actually saw the courts in Arizona intervene and restrict or move them back even further from the ballot drop boxes. So, to a certain extent, I think, the rule of law prevailed here. And once again, the law enforcement community is doing what's necessary to ensure a safe and secure election.
Chris, let's talk about a particular aspect of the process that was very important in 2020 and is likely to be again, and that's vote counting, as we have growing numbers of absentee voters, early voters whose ballots may take a while to count. The outcome, let's say, of the battle to control the Senate, where we'll be waiting for vote counts from Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, that may take a few days. What advice would you give to members of the public about this process of delay? And what's your fear that in the days after Election Day, when the results are not yet announced, we could have threats of violence and actual violence?
David, this is one of my favorite emerging conspiracy theories, which I'll touch on in just a second. But the message here is the same as it was in 2020: is have patience. It takes time to count these votes, and in part, state legislatures have actually made it harder and made it take longer. In Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, for mail-in and absentee ballots, they actually cannot start processing those ballots until the morning of the election. So states could change this. The state legislature could get involved. In the meantime, once again, you have political figures that are coming in and making claims of something of the sort of, all of a sudden we're being told that it takes a long time to decide elections. When that's always been the case. Think back to 2000, Bush v. Gore. That was not decided until December. Mail-in ballots are part of the political process, and as my friend David Becker with the Center for Elections and Innovation Research has said, mail-in ballots date back at least until to the Civil War. So it takes time. Statutes at the state level dictate how long. In fact, the quickest certification in the country is about 8 to 9 days after the election. So it does take time. So my recommendation, again, is just be patient. Look to authoritative sources of information, and those are going to be your state and local election officials. Stephen Richer out in Arizona in Maricopa County is one of my kind of favorites to point to as an example of radical election transparency. But what good election officials do is they tell you where they are in the process and what to expect next. They proactively engage in the information ecosystem to take away any opportunity space or attack surface, really, for disinformation brokers and those that just want to sow chaos. So let's keep our wits about us, stay patient, look to your state and local election officials for the latest on what's going on with the count and what the plan is and the expected timeline is for wrapping up that vote count.
Useful, sensible advice. Thank you for that. I'll ask you a question from our audience. Cheryl Grieve of Washington, D.C. Asks, what can everyday Americans do to help safeguard our democracy in these times of disinformation and distrust? What are your top ideas for building trust in our democracy?
So first and foremost, participate, right? And not just, make sure you've got a voting plan. Make sure you understand, check your registration, which you should have been doing weeks ago. But make sure you know, are you in fact registered? You didn't get bumped off the rolls. Know where you're supposed to go vote. Make sure if there's any ID requirements that you have the ability, have that with you when you show up at the polls. But vote and have a plan for voting. Also, I think any discerning consumer of information should have multiple sources of information, not just the random person you saw on TikTok. No, it's no different than walking down the street and there's somebody screaming something on the corner that you would take that as the gospel, right? You want to have a diverse set of information sources that can allow you to understand what's going on there more broadly. But again, look to your trusted sources of information in elections, and that's going to be your state and local election officials. But most importantly, we just have to just calm it down a little bit. Let's take our time, have a little bit of patience. Maybe put down the phone for a little bit with social media, but I have a lot of confidence in the American people. We can get through this, but the last thing we need to put pressure on our political leaders to lead, to stand up, to talk specifically about election lies, how it's not acceptable in American democracy. We have to hold them accountable, and part of that is, once again, it's getting out there and voting. If we're not seeing the sort of leadership we need out of our political leaders, then we need new leaders.
I want to turn from the subject of intimidation to the subject of actual violence. We saw in recent weeks the terrible attack on Paul Pelosi, Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband, by an attacker demanding, "Where's Nancy?" I want to ask you how you, as a former DHS official, assess the threat of actual violence against our elected officials, Republicans and Democrats alike.
David, this is something that has really exploded over the last couple of years. 2020, you had a number of Secretary of State officials, Jocelyn Benson up in Michigan. I personally received a number of threats. I had people show up at my house. I received all sorts of threats. You name the platform online. I had people sending me emails. I had people using LinkedIn from their professional profiles sending me threats. This is not a rational group of folks sometimes. But there's no question that the lies of 2020 that continue through today and will continue to push through 22 and into 24 are activating, they're radicalizing and activating. I think in part that's what you saw in California. And then just over the weekend, we saw white powder being mailed to the campaign headquarters of Kari Lake, the GOP candidate for governor. This is across the board unacceptable behavior. And once again, we need leaders to step up and talk about this. Now, this in part is also an area, I think, for the Department of Justice, for law enforcement, as I've already mentioned, to get involved and provide tools for election officials to protect themselves. And we saw Georgia just a couple weeks ago, the Brad Raffensperger's office release a tool for reporting of violence. We saw CISA also provide training on de-escalation techniques at polls. So we're seeing an acknowledgement of these threats. We're trying to counter the ones that come in from the foreign space, and we are seeing, continuing to see active engagement from our foreign adversaries. But from a domestic perspective, again, this is where we need to clean up our own house, and we need our leaders to step up and call this stuff out as unacceptable. And we need to investigate and hold accountable those that continue to participate in political violence.
Chris, we know from looking at foreign extremist groups that there's a process of radicalization that takes place. You've spoken of the radicalization of some actors on the domestic political scene. How do you de-radicalize people who've been swept up in a movement, who've been churned by social media and peer pressure into these extreme groups and positions? How does that process start?
I think this is an area where many professional experts are struggling. I personally have a very difficult time with this subject and how you de-radicalize people, because it requires a great deal of empathy. And right now I'm in a little short supply of empathy, given just the prevalence of election denials, and given my experience and kind of the crucible that I and others went through in 2020. But it starts with empathy. We need to engage the people that are promoting, that continue to push these lies, and understand where they're coming from. And then to the extent you can have a conversation, you can understand, you can educate. It's difficult. I get that. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. There's no instant solution here, and it may not actually scale particularly well. But that doesn't mean that we walk away and we just forget about it, because it will only get worse. It will only calcify and metastasize further. And that ultimately, as we've talked about for the last 20 or so minutes, that's just not a good endpoint for democracy. But again, I want to take it back to that leadership piece. Those that are continuing to, at least in the masses, in the base, that continue to push these lies, they're not coming up with this on their own. They're being fed, they're being conned. And that is actually one technique that I think historically works quite well, is if you can expose the people that are leading this con for power, influence, and money. Humans just fundamentally do not like being grifted. They do not like being conned. Now, there is a degree of embarrassment with it, but they also react quite negatively. So we've got to be able to call out and hold these people accountable that continue to push the lies. And there are a number of different mechanisms for that are underway right now, including, I'd point out, Dominion Voting Systems lawsuits against a number of defendants. That's one. Second is again, the second is holding them accountable, these folks accountable at the ballot box. But there are other mechanisms as well.
So it's a new plan, anti-grifting. We'll think about that. So last week, Chris, the head of the U.S. Capitol Police said that his agency responsible for protecting our members of Congress, needs more resources to do the job. Just for some background, startling numbers. In 2021, the Capitol Police reported 9,600 direct or indirect threats against members. That's more than 10 times the number that were reported in 2016. The question is, what kind of resources does the Capitol Police, does law enforcement in general need to protect politicians? We don't want to live in an armed camp, in a police state protecting political officials, but we're going to need more. What's your sense of how significant the additional resources should be?
Well, my hope is that we can actually make the right interventions upstream, where we can, de-radicalize people, where we can also start hitting at some of the mechanisms by which threats are being, which they're being relayed and conveyed, and you start holding people accountable. And you are seeing through the January 6th investigations by the Department of Justice that some of these folks that have made threats are being held accountable. So, to the extent we can move upstream, I think that's probably the best solution. I don't have a specific understanding of what the particular resource requirements of the Capitol Police is, but it makes sense to me that from a leadership perspective, that they require enough bodies, enough officers to help protect the leaders of House, Senate, the congressional, the various parties in Congress. And it's not going to be one of those things where I think you can protect every member of Congress, unfortunately. So we do need to, continue to invest in the capabilities of the Capitol Police to work with local law enforcement as well. And I think that's something that gets left out a little bit of this conversation, is that Capitol Police can work with state and local law enforcement back in the home districts. And those are some of the ways that you can get a little bit more scale, I think, on the protection of the higher value, protectees.
Speaking of upstream, one of the leading incubators, if you will, of political violence, of the threats to democracy that we've been discussing for this half hour, social media, and Twitter has been at the top of the list. Twitter is under new management, as you and all of our viewers know. And the new head of Twitter, Elon Musk, has just gutted the teams that were responsible for monitoring election disinformation. What sort of risk does that pose? And do you think the new owner is acting wisely in this regard?
Well, I think we actually don't have a really good understanding of where the staff cuts hit within Twitter. My understanding of talking to folks inside Twitter is that the trust and safety teams actually retained about 85% of their staffing and headcount. There was some temporary suspension of access to moderation tools across the teams, except to the key leaders, which I think from an insider threat perspective, anytime you have a change of management, a potential reduction in force is happening, you would want to manage the opportunities for disgruntled outgoing employees. So, but those, as I understand it, those tools are being provided access to. It's not as much, frankly, the internal content moderation piece that I'm worried about right now. It's the change in features, particularly what we've heard about with verification for $8 or $7.99 a month, that is happening at a very contentious time in American politics, where you've got a very important midterm, and the original plan, I think, was to open up verification just if you're willing to pay. They would verify on payment details, where historically the blue tick, the blue check mark, has been a marker of trust, right? It's that this person says who they say they are. They're a journalist. They're a political official. Now, remember what I've been saying all along about look to your state and local election officials. Look to those trusted, authoritative sources for information. If you upend that model at a time when authoritative information is absolutely critical, I think there's a significant amount of risk. So it was a good thing, as I see it, that Twitter has paused on rolling out that feature, whether it was due to those concerns I just laid out, or it was more of a technical implementation challenge. But we need to rethink, and they need to be very clear on what the verification status means And it's fine. Look, Elon owns the platform. He can do whatever he wants. But if he is going to make a radical change in the business model and the operating model, you need to clearly communicate to the users, and so we can reset the expectation around what was historically a marker of trust. Now it's just a marker of payment.
You're one of the nation's leading experts on this subject. Has Elon Musk asked for your advice?
Oh, no, unfortunately, I've not heard from Elon. I do know that he's got a good team on board right now inside his company. There are those in the trust and safety team. Yoel Roth is a great example of a leader in this space, and I understand that Elon listens to him. He's been retweeting Yoel's statements and updates on election and misinformation. I would encourage everyone to go follow Yoel to understand what's happening inside Twitter. But nonetheless, it's as I just said, this is a really contentious time. Twitter's going through a number of different radical changes, and the parallel timing of these two tracks does not bode well right now.
So we're out of time. I want to thank Chris Krebs, our guest, for a terrific summary of the issues the day before our election day. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Post.
So we'll be back with other programming on a wonderful range of subjects. If you want to know what's coming up, check WashingtonPostLive.com for more information. I'm David Ignatius. Thanks for joining us.